Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu sitting in for Riz Khan. We are all familiar with the power of music. A song can bring back a long forgotten time in our lives, change our mood, or even get us to move to the beat. It just goes to prove that our brains work in very mysterious ways. Today we discuss the work of a scientist who's been unlocking the secrets of the human brain for decades. Dr. Oliver Sacks is a British neurologist who moved to the United States in the 1960s. In 1973, he published Awakenings, a book about his treatment of patients suffering from sleeping sickness, a devastating illness that swept the world between 1917 and 1928. The disease would leave some victims in a statue-like condition, almost speechless and motionless. During the outbreak, over 5 million died from the disease. In 1990, the book was made into a film starring Robert De Niro and Robin Williams. His stories of people struggling to adapt to different neurological conditions have fundamentally changed the way we think of our own brains. In his latest book, Musicophilia, Dr. Sacks describes how music can animate people with Parkinson's disease who cannot otherwise move, give words to stroke patients who cannot otherwise speak, and calm and organize people whose memories are ravaged by Alzheimer's or amnesia. Dr. Sacks joins us now from Times Square in New York. Don't forget, we take your calls on the show. You can reach us at the numbers there at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Sacks, welcome to the show.
Nice to be with you.
Now, you have spent a large part of your professional life looking at the relationship between body and soul. Can you explain that to us? What is that relationship between body and soul?
You would start with the most difficult question. The human body and the human brain is incredibly complex, and I think complex enough to allow a mind and a spirit and emotions to be there. And so as a neurologist, I'm continually in two worlds, listening to the experiences of my patients and trying to see what goes on in their brains.
Is that a very abstract study, or is it something very practical, something that you could look at?
I think of it as being very, very practical. You can now look at the brain in detail when people are thinking or listening to music or imagining a chess game, whatever. And at the same time, you have an intimate personal relationship with the person. And I think the feeling of physiology and the person go together.
Well, we talked just now about Awakenings, the book that you wrote that was turned into a movie. It tells of your time treating patients in a catatonic state. Those are patients, an affliction rather, which is characterized by a marked lack of movement or even activity. Tell us about that.
Well, in 1966, I went to a hospital in New York where there were 80 people who were absolutely frozen and motionless. Some of them had been like that for 40 years, and the hospital had been first opened in 1920 for these first victims of what was called the sleepy sickness, the encephalitis lethargica, which affected people worldwide at the time. Now, in 1966, when I came, there was no medicine or surgery of any use to these people. And one wondered, what's going on inside? Is anything there? But the nurses were convinced that these people were alive and imprisoned, and they told me that they could be liberated by music. And these people who couldn't take a step could dance, or they could speak with music, and music would give them a flow and a movement they couldn't initiate for themselves.
But you also use drugs, right?
The following year, a drug called L-Dopa became available, and the real permanent awakening happened with that.
And what? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, but whenever the drug effect waned, one could always go back to music and count on it.
Well, that was going to be my next question, actually. What were the long-term effects of this kind of treatment?
The first effects seemed absolutely miraculous and lyrical, and people sort of felt resurrected. Then they started to run into various complications. The effects of the drug would oscillate sometimes from hour to hour or even minute to minute. Some of them had frightening side effects. And so much so that one patient after a few months said that stuff should be given its real name, L-Dopa. But then, although the movie doesn't show this, although the movie just confines itself to 1969, in fact the medication continued to have reasonably good effects for the rest of the people's lives. And indeed, one of the patients came along to the film set in 1990 and did a scene with De Niro.
Now, as a neurologist, you've treated many patients with a variety of different kinds of music, with a variety of problems. You've treated them with music, and there are many case histories in the book that we talked about earlier on musicophilia. How does that kind of treat? How do you treat people with music?
Right. Well, for people with Parkinson's, they need rhythm. The music has to be strongly rhythmical, and basically it is the human propensity to move with the rhythm. This seems to be a uniquely human propensity. Children spontaneously dance with rhythm, and people who are frozen with Parkinson's can move with rhythm. With people who have Alzheimer's disease or aphasia, who have Alzheimer's disease or difficulty remembering, for them music can be a carrier of the past. They need old songs from the past, songs which will bring back scenes and relationships, and this for people who may not be able to remember the events of their life because of their amnesia. Different again is for people who've had a stroke or something and have lost the ability to speak, who have aphasia. Even though they may be unable to speak, these people are always able to sing, and often to get the words of a song. And this in itself shows that language is there somewhere inside them, even if it's apparently locked in the song. And there the therapy is to unlock the words from the song so they can acquire language again. And this can have a permanent effect with them, whereas the effect of music with people with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's just lasts a few minutes.
So are you saying that we have this inherent ability to decode music? There is natural harmony in us.
I think very much so. The human nervous system is richly set up for speech and for music, almost more so for music. There are 20 or 30 different parts of the brain which respond to pitch, to rhythm, to melody, to harmony, to different aspects of music. And I think we are a very musical species.
Now, you did say that some of the changes were permanent, but what are the long-term results? What have you found?
Well, certainly people who've had aphasia can often relearn language, even if there's been extreme damage in the first place, and music may be crucial there. But I think music can also make a great deal of difference to the lives of people with dementia, to the lives of people with autism, and of course to people who are depressed. You know, going back to the famous biblical story of David and Saul, it's always been understood that music has a tremendous power for the individual, and of course a power for the community. Music bonds people, it brings them together. I think music is primarily a communal activity of singing and dancing and praying together.
You know, that takes us very nicely to an email which we just received from Muriel Eaton in Montreal, Canada. And she wants to know what kind of music is used for what kind of brain ailment. I am a harpist and have often observed how it soothed patients like a massage through the ears. I also noticed that the lower range of the instrument was more effective than the treble. I suppose you use classical and world music, but what composers and pieces do you prefer for therapy?
Well, it's nice to hear from this lady who's in the great tradition, of course, of David the harpist. This is very much up to the patients, but as I say, for Parkinsonian patients, the music must have rhythm. For Alzheimer patients, the music must be familiar. And for people with aphasia, it must be music with words which they can sing to. In general, the sort of lower ranges of instruments are more calming than the higher ranges. The higher ranges are more exciting.
And is it always classical music that you use?
No, it can be anything. A lot of my patients are older and more brought up in classical music, but modern music, jazz, rock, heavy metal, whatever works.
Okay, let's go to the phones. We have a viewer calling from London. Amara in London. What's your question, Amara?
I'm trying to sort of like clarify, if you could clarify, the link between the brain activity and the musical activities here. It's not that clear at all. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, Amara, what was your question?
You're trying to explain the link between, I'm trying to understand the link between the brain activity and the musical activity happening here. that initiate the movement.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Okay. Well, one can explain one thing. In human beings, and only in human beings, there are anatomical links between the auditory parts of the brain and the motor parts of the brain. And so there's already a system set up which allows us to move in synchrony with the music. And you don't find this in chimpanzees. This is a purely human network.
Now, these kinds of neurological disorders that you treat with music, is it pretty widespread around the world? Are other doctors doing this?
Well, I feel it should be. It is in the States and in England and in Sweden and in Holland, to my knowledge, it is moderately widespread. I think that music therapy partly suffers from being exaggerated and partly from being dismissed. You know, what I've tried to do here is to, in my book, is to provide, you know, some of the evidence for the real effects and the real limitations. But the power of music is very real, and of course it's a joy, and you know, it's something which should be part, I think, of medical practice.
Let me ask you about music and early child development. You know, there are these CDs which are sold in children's toy stores, the Mozart Cds, which are played to babies, infants, and they create what has come to be known as the Mozart effect. Do they work?
I don't think so. I don't think that just listening to Mozart will have much effect. It may be pleasant. What one needs is real engagement with music and some musical training, and that can have quite profound effects, not only increasing musical capacities and causing enlargement of various parts of the brain, but increasing ability to read and reasoning power and so forth. But one needs musical training and not just a little Mozart under the pillow.
So I want to ask you about that. So just listening to music in what I would describe as a passive way, that's not going to help your one's cognitive ability, the ability of the brain to grow and develop. One has to engage in the music itself.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I want to go to another email here. This one is from Samar El-Bini in Belgium, and he writes, I have multiple sclerosis. Do you also treat people with this ailment? People with MS have problems with concentration, but not quite a lot of memory loss.
Yes, I do see people with multiple sclerosis with all sorts of neurological problems. Some of them have problems with musical recognition or musical response, but others may respond very well to music and find their spasticity is less and their movement is freer and their thought is more organized with music. So although I haven't specifically written about music and MS, I think this is something I will do.
All right, let's go to another one of our viewers. This is John calling from Bahrain. John, go ahead with your question.
Hello there. Hi, Dr. Sachs. Thank
Hello.
you very much for the wonderful books you've written. I'm a bit of a singer myself, and one of the most famous singers to treat depression was Farinelli, who sang the same 4 songs for the King of Spain for decades every night. I'm just
This
wondering...
is the famous castrato.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, right.
I'm just wondering if you've looked at the treatment of depression and the use of the human voice in that, and whether you drew any conclusions about type of voice, male or female, and type of music.
Well, one of the chapters in my book is about music and depression and lamentations and music and mourning. I think the human voice is especially equipped to bring back a feeling of life and memories of life. I mean, for myself, once when I was quite depressed after my mother's death, it was some Schubert songs which brought me back. And I also quote someone who was greatly affected by Brahms' Alto Rhapsody. And I think, now you bring this up, I think that every case I mention, in fact, involves the human voice, although I hadn't specifically thought of this until you brought it up.
All right, John, thank you for your question. Dr. Sachs, do you still treat many patients?
Yes, I still work part-time. I work for 2.5 days a week, and otherwise I travel, I write, I swim, whatever.
Well, I just want to ask you about some personal questions here. While I was researching this interview, I came across something which I thought was very interesting, and that is your eating habits. I read that you eat the same things for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day.
Well, I do have a tendency that way. I live alone. I don't shop much. It saves time not to have to make choices.
But don't you ever get bored?
No, I don't get bored. It's very curious. I don't get bored any more than I get bored with the same pieces of music or the same swimming pool. I find a certain comfort in repetition.
And I presume there are things that you do that are impulsive.
Oh, I'm very impulsive. I sometimes speak to strangers in the street. I write lots of letters, sometimes to authors of books I read. I take off and travel suddenly. Yeah, I'm not short of impulses.
Okay, let's take another call. This is a viewer calling us from Namibia. Musa in Namibia. Go ahead with your call.
Yes, I'm calling with respect to a disorder called trigeminal neuralgia, which has to do with having severe pain on one side of the face. I want to understand whether Dr. Sachs also treats such a disorder.
I'm not sure that I heard all of you. You speak of a neuralgia which affects the face.
The medical term is called trigeminal neuralgia.
I'm sorry, trigeminal neuralgia. Yes.
That's correct.
No, right. No, this is can be a terrible affliction. There are sudden, intense, lightning-like flashes of pain in the face. It makes people twitch, and before there was adequate therapy, something like 40% of the people who had this would commit suicide. But there are now good medical treatments. There are drugs, mostly anticonvulsants, which are very useful, and there are also surgical treatments, so that no one need suffer from trigeminal neuralgia anymore.
All right, Musa, thank you very much for your question. Dr. Sachs, we have literally 20 seconds left. I was wondering if you could just answer this question from one who came through on email. And it says, why has the neurological fraternity not been able to attract the same attention and funding that cancer and AIDS research attract?
I think it's often because neurological diseases are regarded as incurable and progressive. But this is not the case. We are now beginning to get a real handle on things like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's, and there should be much more funding.
Dr. Oliver Sachs, thank you very much for joining us.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. And don't forget, if you have any thoughts about pressing issues around the world, send your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. See you next time. Street Talk is next.